I See Glutamates, an editorial by Robin Hood, Part 4. The general public is extremely unaware about what this all means to our health. I think if people were told that they were consuming a high volume of compounds that could be poisonous, we might demand better food labeling, to say the least. I personally believe it's our right to ingest poisons if we want to, as long as we don't infringe on other people while doing so. In this case of glutamates, they're actually needed in small amounts to power the neurons. So in this case of glutamates, there's a minimum that's required, but I also believe there's a threshold that can be reached, and when you exceed it, you do a lot of damage. As I mentioned, glutamates tend to have an addictive quality, so for this reason, those that learn about them gain the upper hand against those naive of them. After all, anything that offers more flavor tends to be fairly addictive. So I offered this little bit of wisdom. Be a little bit careful maybe what you crave. Often when something tastes incredibly wonderful to you, there may be a glutamate lurking. I'm also beginning to formulate a new hypothesis outside of science. Especially in the last 10 years or so, I think some savvy food engineers are now relying on the public's naivety of glutamates. After all, you may just be learning about glutamates and glutamic acid right now. Does a food scientist bank on the fact that a compound sounds complex, and this outcry will fall on deaf ears or will be kept hidden under common or complex names like casein, autolyze this, or hydrolyze that? Part of the problem is that glutamates are pretty easy to make. Additionally, they're really cheap. After all, one company's tasty food has to compete with another company's tasty food. So if you pile on more glutamates, it's cost effective, right? I'm wondering what happened to traditional spices. I mean, we all know traditional spices actually cost a lot. So the next time you see natural flavors listed on the side of a package, you kind of have to wonder if it's just filled with glutamates, since they are natural, of course. You see, what chef doesn't want his award-winning soup not to taste like dishwater, or bread not to taste stale, or spaghetti sauce not rich? Here lies the problem with glutamates at its foundation. When a glutamate is alongside another flavor on the human tongue, it's a really yummy flavor after all. When something generally tastes better, it usually sells better. Now think of competition over a period of time. The companies must make an equally palatable food competitor, so how do you do this cheaply? Now, whether these food designers knowingly understand or not the harm of a glutamate, they might be off the hook for blame. But now the evidence is starting to roll in on a daily basis, and it's up to the people to choose foods that have less glutamates in them. Competition can be driven back in the other direction for foods less flavorful to cure this hidden epidemic if it actually is one. Yes, I do believe our food supply has been tainted with a great concentration of glutamates. And for whatever reason, some people may be able to handle the glutamates better than other people. However, our freedom to choose foods without glutamates have been compromised. It has become increasingly hard to seek out basic natural foods that are not loaded down with glutamates. And to make matters worse, food labeling is extremely obscure when it comes to the breakdown of protein composition. No one appears to be willing to step up to the plate in the scientific community to focus upon the overwhelming evidence. And besides our food supply, I've recently found out that glutamates are put in live vaccines as preservatives in high concentration. I'm actually not sure how long these glutamates have been put in the live vaccines, but it hit me that the whole mercury scare might have hidden the true problem of autism in children. So, what have you learned about glutamates already? They excite the neurotransmitters in the brain. Now, what would happen to a 2-year-old that weighs only about 30 pounds that gets maybe 10 to 15 live vaccines within a year? Do you think that this extra blast of glutamates might be to blame? This is at least an idea that should be investigated, don't you think? But more scary to me, why hasn't this been talked about? It's been information that's been available for at least a year or two now, and why haven't you heard about this? Again, with the anti-glutamate research being done on Alzheimer's, you'd think they probably would do the same for autism. Although I have yet to research this next subject, I'm also curious to know if excitotoxins like aspartame and glutamates may be the root problem with the complaints in schools about ADD, attention deficit disorder. See, this is what's really interesting to me. You have ADD, autism, Alzheimer's, obesity, all in the same window of time, around 1985, when all these epidemics started. This happens to coincide with the window of time when MSG was highly introduced into our food supply. This is why I'm beginning to believe more and more that doctors and our medical professionals are simply not educated in the prevalence of glutamic acid, or they simply dismiss this idea and the collection of evidence around it. And this may be just a symptom of food mimicking. I mean, imagine a food back from the 1970s, how it looked and how it tasted, and then look at a comparable food today. They're basically looking the same, even though the ingredients inside are quite different. From other sources I've read, receptors for glutamates compete with another amino acid called taurine. As some nursing mothers may have already known, taurine has been added to many baby formulas to help brain development. So does taurine help block glutamate damage for the first year or so until the child begins to eat solid foods? It also turns out that ibuprofen might be a glutamate blocker as well. And vitamin B6 and magnesium may also help control glutamate levels. Could ibuprofen be used as a method to help block the glutamates around the time period a vaccine is given? Sounds pretty plausible. Of course, the assumption being that there's glutamates in the vaccine. But here's something that's even maybe a little more profound than what you've already heard. It appears that scientists inject glutamates into lab rats to fatten them up faster when conducting obesity trials. And now it looks like there are clinical tests being done using anti-glutamate drugs to combat obesity. You see, certain people can take advantage of other people, especially if they understand glutamates are so rampant in our food supply. Then they're guaranteed a percentage of obese people. Think of it this way. First they sell the glutamates, then of course the anti-glutamic drug later. Profit can be made from not knowing how to prevent it yourself. I've also recently heard the word metabolism being thrown around as a catchword to make an expert appear to know exactly what they're talking about, a way to keep you from discovering the truth here. If you're like me and know that you've put a vast amount of effort and time into the attempt to lose fat, and no matter what you do, the effort you put forth, you cannot seem to shed the weight, you soon feel like just giving up. Again, I'm not telling you this is the answer for your personal condition. It may just be a piece to the puzzle. But just remember, you might be fed daily the thing that fattens up mice and keeps them obese all the time. So do glutamate pushers actually exist out there? Do they knowingly feed you a poison, even though you're not aware that you're eating the poison, and then sell you a medicine that appears to work against the poison? And then does the glutamate pusher get some kind of praise and maybe even a Nobel Peace Prize for curing obesity? Yes, I know this reeks of conspiracy theory, but look at the timelines about when obesity hit the US and when glutamates hit the US as well. I'm still waiting for a website that keeps track of food labels from the 1970s versus the 1980s versus the 1990s and so forth. I suspect the candies and junk food back then may have been somewhat healthy in comparison to the junk food we have today. For one, I remember slamming down all kinds of candy bars in the late 70s and early 80s, but I was a kid, of course. I never really gained an ounce of weight at that time. Also, I don't recall any of my classmates being really obese, and only a few of them were a little bit overweight. Did something happen in the mid-1980s, and food labeling may hold the answer if someone would research the past? I'm thinking if companies would get back to making foods like they did in the 1970s, then the competition could be driven the other direction once people knew what they were really eating these days.